now it's on. Oh. Okay, in future, can someone say that? It looks like it's on here. I apologise. Did anyone at the back catch that, or do I have to start again? I'm not starting again. Yeah, apologies recording. I just realised that the thing was not on. Yeah, sorry. That's not a good start to the week. Definite case of the Mondays. Okay, so some open issues / problems in this space. Now, there's an awful lot of people globally doing all sorts of fun stuff in that exploit sort of phase of it, and indeed the phases that come before that. It's lots of fun to make a new exploit and then put that out there and become internet famous in hacker circles and stuff. But actually, getting all that initial information gathering and pulling all of that together is actually non-trivial in and of itself. And there's a couple of tools in this space, but most of the time, if you're looking at your information gathering, you're probably actually using a couple of tools together. There's no like one perfect tool to then be doing all of that. There's some that are really good for mapping out networks. And so you feed in all this information about the network, and it gives you nice little network topology stuff based on what you've discovered. Some of that stuff you might be doing in analysis phase could be social engineering stuff. And so really the best option there is probably an Excel spreadsheet, just about, you know, as you've talked to different people and you've cold called them on the phone to find out names, to try and guess some usernames and that sort of stuff. So the analysis phase, there's all sorts of ways of approaching it. Sometimes with social engineering, even walking into the building, that sort of stuff. And so a lot of that stuff doesn't really have that many neat software tools to be using. Penetration phase, this is where there's that high level of skill. And actually developing exploits and the tools themselves is really where that's at. So if you're doing pen testing for one of those big accounting firms and you're going and doing a pen test for a government department or a multinational company, the kind of exploits that are going to work against their networks, generally speaking, aren't ones that have been published everywhere. Their networks are pretty secured and should be getting patched quite often. So the exploits you need then are actually heavily customised bits of software to do it. So in our pracs, we'll be using a couple of frameworks to get exploits, and they're stuff that's been written by people that are indeed very, very smart, but you personally, by using that, don't actually have their level of smarts automatically to be able to modify that into the kind of thing that's then going to work against, say, Coca-Cola or something. And so that's, while it's an issue, it's actually really a way of saying this is actually a high-skilled area. And if you're interested in it and spend lots of time, there's certainly lots of job interviews there, job opportunities there, and those sorts of jobs at those big accounting firms are where you get really, really good pay packets, to put it that way. Just because you know a vulnerability exists doesn't always imply that it can be exploited easily. This is really what that's drawing down to. We're all probably fairly well aware that vulnerabilities exist. We get patches on our OS, and it appears there and says it's a security patch. So we're aware that there's some vulnerability there that could be exploited. From that little piece of knowledge, most people in this room, if not all the other people in this room, wouldn't really know, what do I do next to actually make an exploit for that? That is a particular set of skills which we're not going to teach you in this unit, unfortunately. I don't have time for that. But that is the kinds of skill sets we're talking about in that space. Now, hopefully in this unit, as we talk about pen testing and talk about and see some exploits happen, you see the value there. And if you're super interested in it and you do have some skills in that area, yeah, there's a career path there. The rest of you, it's about knowing what this process is, because organisations, and increasingly most organisations of any size, will be doing pen testing on a regular basis. Otherwise, they've got no idea, no assurance level on how well their policies are actually working. Cleanup phase is a bit of a tricky one as well. The easiest way is to just take all your systems and just blow everything away and do a backup and restore the backup, which is very much the job of the customer. They're the ones that actually have got the backups. You don't have those as the actual person attacking. It's the only real way to verify that you know that no trace of this attack has left some problem behind. Ideally, though, our reporting and things that we've put in should then be saying exactly what we did to get in so they can try and undo things. But yeah, it's a non-trivial thing to get things back up to what they were beforehand. So for those who missed everything, because the mic wasn't on, here's the summary for you. We've talked about pen testing. It's a very useful tool. It does tend to be in the units that I teach a bit about it. Most students who sort of like those units on any level tend to find it's the part they actually quite like the most. They might find that it's actually way more boring than they expected, but they actually go, well, that was actually interesting, because no one in any other subject says, hey, let's break into a computer. That's not really what people then tend to find in other units. So it does tend to be something that's interesting. But that interest level is in a very high-skilled thing to actually make those exploits. And as we move through this unit, we get into, say, the second assignment, and we're writing policies and designing policies. The way of testing those policies, or one of the main ways of testing those policies, is actually through pen testing and saying, well, are these effective? Are they going to do the job that we're actually hoping that they would do? There are ethical and legal considerations. We don't do this without permission. In the context of this unit, we're going to use some of these tools. You're not allowed to use those tools on the university network. So we'll be using them in the networks lab with the network cable unplugged. If you got found on campus using some of the software on your laptop on the normal network, there's nothing I can do. You're on your own at that point. You're not allowed to use your actual agreement you signed to say, yes, I'll use the network, here's my password, says that this sort of software you're not going to use on the university network. The exception to that being in the networks lab with the cable unplugged is the one scenario you're allowed to use it in. So yeah, by all means, play with this sort of stuff on your own hardware, just not on campus. Do it at home or a cafe in town or whatever. As long as I don't know about it, I go la 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 la, it's all good. And I can be at home playing with it myself. Okay, wrong laptop. There's a reading on Milo that relates to this section. I think it's the week 3 reading. And it's a reading taken from the ethical hacking sort of study guide. There's a whole bunch of certifications you can get in the networking space and in IT generally. There are certifications around ethical hacking. The study book for this is about yay thick, and I've actually got the introduction there that's just looking at the ethics of it and the purpose of it as a reading. So that is one of the readings. It is examinable content for the exam, so make sure you have a read of that. Further reading that's not examinable at all. NIST in America is where lots of standards and stuff come out. They have a couple of times put up security testing sort of guidelines and steps. They're due for another one. They haven't updated since 2008, but it is worth having a look at if you are curious about this. It's still relevant because all what it's talking about aren't saying, oh, use X tool or Y tool. It's talking about methodologies as a whole. Okay, what we're going to do now before we have our quick little break is do attendance. So I need you all to open up whatever device you've got on you, your phone, your laptop. Go to Milo, log into Milo. All right, has everyone logged into Milo and gone to assessments and found the week 2 quiz? Click on the week 2 quiz. There's a little password field if you scroll down. The password is stillness. It's just a random word off a poster in my office. All right. Once you've typed that in, here's some things, and I'll stand in here. You've got one question to answer. It's all randomised. There's like 6 different questions or whatever. Don't take a picture. No picture. If I see you take a picture, you will immediately lose marks. All right. Has everyone answered their question? What was it? All right, has everyone done it? Hurry up. Everyone should see this movie, it's really good. All right, has everyone done it? Slow, is it? Ah, dear. You in the orange, I'm going to come and get your name in a second. I told you not to take pictures. You've just lost your mark. I don't care. I told you not to take pictures. Is everyone finished? Everyone submitted? Come on. Faster internet, faster. You can't figure it out? It's a really easy question. If you can't figure it out. All right, 5, 4, 3. Come on. How have you not done it yet? Are you that slow? Is it done now? Cool? All right. All right, we'll have a 10-minute break. Come back at 5 past.
Try to use my cell phone to fund it, but I have no time. This is my
I'll do it manually. I've got a picture of your name.
Okay. or there are lots of small?
Automated systems deal with things. So it really depends on the actual. I think you put up the question after
In my house.
degree coordinator. I can't even see that page to look at it. So, Erin's the master's degree coordinator. Erin. So if you go to the school office where Chris is sitting, by the glass doors. Yes, yeah, ICT building. Erin behind those glass doors. Chris will make you an appointment to see him. Okay? All right, everyone, let's get going again. Okay, so in that first hour, we looked at pen testing, which has a phase in it where we're basically attacking a system. This next hour, we're going to look at a few different attack types, some of which we'll end up seeing in some of our practicals, but it's about just being generally informed about some kinds of computer kinds of attacks. In this unit, in coming weeks, we're going to have a lecture around threat and risk analysis. We will have a practical around threat and risk analysis before we then, in our assignment, have to do a threat and risk analysis about the different kinds of attacks that could occur about a company and how we would defend that company. So this is sort of like little step one, getting a bit of awareness of kinds of attacks before we have to look at them from a threat and risk analysis sort of perspective in the context of our assignment. Now, an attack, basically, you can kind of see it as sort of like this sort of three-step sort of procedure almost. We need to have some kind of vulnerability, an error or a weakness in what we've got there. So it could be from our poor design of our defensive perimeter or whatever it might be, or the way we've poorly configured our server. It could be 100% our fault as the network or the server admin, 100%. Or the programmer of our internal software that we're using. It could be our fault. It could be a flaw in something we've paid for. We've bought Windows and it comes ready supplied with lots of vulnerabilities. It could be something like that. It doesn't particularly matter where it is. If there's a vulnerability in our systems, doesn't matter if we made the mistake or someone else that we've effectively paid has made the mistake, it is there. That then means we actually have the possibility of a threat. There's a level of likelihood that someone could make use of that vulnerability to actually exploit it to get into our system in some way or to harm our system in some way. Not necessarily get in. It could be to stop it from functioning. It could result in a denial of service attack, for example. So just because we've got a vulnerability doesn't necessarily mean we've got a threat that's going to happen. If we do our threat analysis, we might go, oh, here's a vulnerability. The sort of threat profile for that is actually, if we think about it and look at motivations of people and stuff, the amount of effort to make use of that vulnerability might be ginormous. Therefore, we're not super worried about it. It might take an awful lot of effort to make use of it. Or it could be, in the sorts of threats we hear about in like mainstream media and stuff, is when there's been some kind of flaw that has a very low threshold of effort to make use of, a very high likelihood that that threat could end up being used. So we're always going to have vulnerabilities. Being aware of that, in our threat analysis, we end up figuring out the likelihood that they could occur. That threat is going to be an amount of effort to actually exploit. If someone goes to that amount of effort and actually uses that vulnerability in some way to actually eventuate a threat, what we have then is an attack. They've carried out the steps required to make use of that vulnerability to harm us in some way. It's a good way to sort of think about the structure of what we're talking about and seeing in multiple points in this unit. As we spend time thinking about threats, as we carry out attacks in the lab, that's what we've got to try and think about. In this unit, we're not going to talk too much about vulnerabilities, but realistically, of these three things, the vulnerabilities are probably the thing we're most aware of, even though we don't understand them in our systems. Because we're always getting patches for our phone, for our laptop, and if we go and look at what the patch is, it says it's a security patch. It's because there's a vulnerability. So we're aware of how common vulnerabilities are, what we're aiming to do in this unit is to really add to that ever so basic awareness of vulnerabilities by starting to think of the likelihood of it being used and how much effort it might be to actually use something and commit an attack. Now, as we look at attacks in this unit, and specifically this lecture, we can classify them in a few different ways. In 501, we learned all about the OSI model. And so one way of classifying attacks is to think about it from that technical perspective of what are they attacking? What are they getting access to? Or what level in our computer are they? Are they at the application level, at which case they've probably got access to all of our data? Or are they attacking us down at the IP level or whatever it might be, which as we look at some of our cryptographic protocols, we'll then be seeing, oh yeah, IPsec operates at that IP level. So that can defend us against stuff that occurs sort of below that or at that level. If it's appearing above that, it gives us zero protection at all. So it's about getting that sort of level of informed awareness of our threat going on there. Now, the other way we can talk about them, which is probably easier and fits in a little bit nicer with our sort of security mindset, is to think about how they fit in relation to our CIA triad. Is it an attack on confidentiality? Are they getting access to data? Whoops, access to data we don't want them to have access to? Is it availability? Is it a denial of service attack where people can't use our service now and that is the entire goal of the attack? They're not getting access to any content of ours that's secret, but they're stopping anyone legitimate from using our service. So we can classify them in that sort of way as well. So as we work through, we'll largely be doing it based on the CIA side of it, but the OSI layer is something we can think about at the same time as well. So if we were to group a whole bunch of attacks together in terms of attacks on confidentiality, where someone is gaining access to stuff we don't want them to have access to, we're going to see in the readings we do, in the stuff we carry out in the lab, in things that get mentioned in lectures, we're going to see there's a whole range of attacks that fall in that category. Eavesdropping is the sort of classical term of describing this, which is probably a slightly odd term. I'm not sure if it's a word that makes any sense to an international student who doesn't have English as their first language. Eavesdropping is listening on to things that other people are doing. So the eavesdropping thing is there's a conversation going on in a room and someone's basically outside, out the window, maybe down a floor, listening in what's happening up in a room. That's what eavesdropping is. It's a very classical, what happened hundreds of years ago when people were talking about secret stuff. Eavesdropping was then listening in. In a digital context, we still use that term to kind of describe that. But what we're reading, what we're meaning, is someone's reading our content as it goes across the network. Eavesdropping, reading our content that could be there in clear text that's very easy to read. Reading the content. Interception. So someone's seeing the content go past, they've grabbed it. At this point, they could just read it and forward it on, which is basically eavesdropping, or they could modify it and send it on. That interception, that layer of jumping in the middle, gives you the possibility of changing it and sending it on, which is obviously an integrity thing. But with interception, yes, it's an attack on integrity, but they can also read it, so it's confidentiality. It actually hits C and I in that triad. Spoofing is where we're sort of pretending to be someone else, and they'll then reveal stuff to us that they wouldn't have revealed to us if they didn't think we were someone else in the first place. Man in the middle and session. We'll actually come into these in a couple of slides of their own. Man in the middle attacks we sort of mentioned a little bit before, and that's what that interception's really doing. But we carry out the entire conversation in the middle, us changing what each side's seeing, and session hijacking will jump in as well. So we'll come back around to those with little slides that describe each one. Integrity. So this is where we've had someone modify content. So if we remember our sort of definition of integrity from 501, integrity is having data in the state that the last authorised user left it. So the last authorised person, the data is still in the state that they left it. It hasn't been changed by an unauthorised person. That's what we're talking about with integrity. So these are about modifying content before someone else actually gets it. So replay attacks, backdoor attacks, interception, man in the middle, those are in that sort of category. Now, these are very much about trying to actually present a different picture to the person that's actually reading. These are very much more, you can think about it in that networking context. If we're thinking about it in terms of a server controlled by a company and we've broken into it, maybe we're doing a pen test, and we're trying to see, could we actually hurt the integrity of their database server? By getting in, we could think, oh, can we actually make changes to their database without them knowing it? Can we actually, in a banking context, change the amount of money in our bank account without the bank knowing it and just make ourselves richer? A nice little classical sort of example there. That's a modification attack, altering the integrity of that data there. Availability. So denial of service is probably the one we've heard the most about, other than confidentiality in sort of the pop press sort of side of things. It's the one that might affect us the most in a direct way without it being particularly negative. If someone steals our credit card, it's very negative and it affects us in a pretty substantial way. But of the other kinds of attacks that have probably affected us, that doesn't really probably have too much effect, is a denial of service. We go to play a computer game and someone's doing a denial of service against Blizzard or whatever and we can't sign on. It affects us, but not in a particularly big way. A little while ago, 18 months ago now, there was a big denial of service attack in our Australian context around our census where that got taken. There's lots of examples of denial of service attacks occurring. They often occur for some sort of political message as well, and those sorts of things. Distributed denial of services tend to what we sort of see today. You go onto the black market and you buy a couple of thousand or hundreds of thousands of bots, and that's how you do your denial of service. You get all the bots to actually go and attack this one thing at a time, one thing at once. The biggest denial of service attack ever occurred last Thursday, I think Wednesday or Thursday last week. It peaked at 1.3 terabytes of data per second going to one server. Saying that, the biggest one ever, it's a moving target. We get a bigger one every year because as network capacity goes up, as you go to measure it, how much data was used to take out, to do the denial of service attack, it obviously goes up. But the record was surpassed last week against GitHub. So GitHub, very common collaboration tool for sharing code and stuff, had a denial of service attack last Wednesday, Thursday, depending on where you are in the world at the time. And yeah, 1.3 terabytes per second, which is a lot of data. The other A that we have is authentication. We'll spend a bit of time looking at these. Now, again, like the session hijacking earlier is an example of this as well. We're flogging someone's token in that sort of context. We'll spend a bit of time on this in this unit, in that I said before that week 13, we're going to be breaking some passwords. That's clearly an attack on authentication. As we start doing some of our exploit stuff, we'll actually do some very simple Unix kind of, oh, what accounts are here? Can we actually brute force a password in that context? So we'll see some of that in about week 4 as well. So attacks around authentication, they're incredibly common as well. So they can all be very easily classified into our different categories. Now, a lot of these are not all that new. When we look at CIA as those concepts, all of them are very obvious attack categories that weren't invented when computers were invented. They already existed. Someone impersonating someone else to then get access to an area is as old as armies have been around. You know, someone being a spy to sneak in is impersonating. You know, breaking encryption. We'll do a little bit of that in week 12 when we break one of the oldest known cryptographic ciphers around, Caesar cipher, as a little fun little desk exercise before we then go and look at AES and learn a little bit about current crypto tools. So each of these, not particularly new. Denial of service. This one's a classic one. We all think, oh, that's clearly invented with computers. Not at all. Siege warfare is denial of service. The first thing you do when you set up a siege around a castle, cut off the water supply. Denial of service of water into castle by diverting rivers and stuff. It used to happen all the time in like the 1300s and stuff. Just divert the river, starve them out, thirst them out. Denial of service. Why is that not moving? There we go. So the password attacks we saw there under authentication, they're a very common place to start for an attacker. Under that grey box testing in pen testing we saw in the first hour, we saw it sort of, it has an example of, getting the secretary's account and then trying to move laterally inside the organisation after that. Once you get into a system, it's usually not hard to get a list of other accounts on that system. Once you've got the username, you've got half of it. You've got the usernames, then you've just got to find a password that actually goes to those usernames. So you start doing password attacks against known usernames. Known usernames are actually fairly easy to get generally. It's not hard to find email addresses online and email addresses for organisations. Most organisations tend to have their logins to corporate systems matching the username on their emails. UTAS is pretty much the same on that. Yeah, I've said all that. Oh, that we have broken, so we will broken. I've moved this lecture this year, and I've moved that too. Okay, so eavesdropping, I've already sort of defined there. In this context, there's passive and active. So the active one we've already seen in 501, and at least one tutor of you this week has already seen it kind of in Wireshark. The rest of you will fire up Wireshark again in this week's practical. In our lab, when we're using Wireshark, it makes us think, oh, that's just silly because it's just in the lab. But actually, any node between where we are and the server we're communicating to is able to look at the content. They're able to fire up something like Wireshark and have a look at it. That's how things like the Great Firewall of China work. The data's got to go along, and so if it's in clear text, they can look at it and decide what to do with it. If it's encrypted, then it becomes hard. They've got to try and break the encryption, and we'll touch on something about that in a moment. But if our data's not encrypted, the moment it's going across a network, it's basically anyone who owns that network can really look at that and see what's going on there. And we'll see that in Wireshark this week. The passive attack stuff here is an interesting thing as well. That comes back to the sort of older style type thing of just actually overhearing stuff. Social engineering is an area of computer security that often we don't really think too much about, but it actually is an area that pen testers use all the time. If you get hired to pen test for an organisation, what you do is you often just go in there, see what you can actually learn or see in person. You haven't left a digital footprint then. If they've got cameras, you often might go to Skies or something. There's countless videos of pen testing that have occurred online, that they've filmed everything they've done to show what they've undertaken. Often it's involved trying to sneak in and shove a USB into the back of a computer when no one's looking. But often in those attacks, they actually go in there and actually listening. They're trying to learn other things that are going on there and eavesdropping in that context, see what secrets people will say about the organisation that help you to get in digitally at a later time. Spoofing is when you act to be someone. You masquerade as someone else. You try to trick them into being it. It's not particularly hard to get a machine to pretend to be a different IP address and receive messages intended for other machines. It's quite straightforward. There's some tools that allow us to do it in Kali. We won't particularly doing much of that in this unit, but it's not too hard to learn about IP spoofing. One of the main ways to do it, especially in like a wireless network, is through ARP spoofing. So we learned about ARP in 501. ARP is the protocol that aligns our MAC address to an IP address. So we know the logical address of who we're trying to communicate with. We try to learn the MAC address so we can actually do that next hop. By ARP spoofing, we basically just try to remap the MAC address that owns the IP address to us instead of the true computer it's actually meant for, so that messages that are supposed to go to them actually come to us. We're then able to do what we want with that message. Maybe we send it on to the correct destination. But ARP spoofing is one of the main ways we might do that. DNS spoofing is what we're doing if we're sort of outside of our network and we're trying to have a bit more of an impact across maybe a geographical region or a country. We try to then propagate false DNS messages. Now, it's pretty hard to do in a full global context because of the way DNS is set up. There's a hierarchy of DNS servers, and to try and actually get false DNS information in every DNS server globally is actually really hard. But usually if you see it occurring in news stories or things that have occurred, you see that it affects geographic regions. They've successfully DNS spoofed a thing across a region. It's pretty trivial to do to an organisation because you just trick their one server. But if you can actually get a couple of European countries or a country in Asia or Australia or New Zealand to then affect enough of those DNS servers, you could actually get lots of people going to the wrong website. So they think they're going to a particular website and they're going to a fake version of it and you're flogging their credentials. This example's got mybank.com, whatever that is, and you're redirecting them to a fake website. You get their logins and then you're able to log into their banking website. Man in the middle is one of the sort of classic attacks. We talked about this briefly in 501. SSL being our main way of overcoming this, where we're actually getting proof of who we're talking to through asymmetric encryption. But man in the middle, what we're aiming to do is Bob and Alice here want to talk to each other, and Eve is inserting herself into their conversation, talking to each of them, pretending to be the other end, fully reading what's going on in the communication. Again, this sounds very much like a must have been invented with computers kind of attack, but it's not. There's a pretty classic case of it in England 500 years ago that resulted in Queen Elizabeth chopping off Mary's head. We'll talk about that later. But that was conventional letters that were being sent with a little bit of crappy cryptography, but a little bit of cryptography there all the same. And they thought they were securely communicating, and it was actually going through a third party who'd actually put themselves in the middle and were actually reading the letters and changing details and things like that. So man-in-the-middle attack is a very common sort of goal attack that people sort of want. Malicious Wi-Fi access points are often attempting to do this. People want you to join their Wi-Fi access point. They then read all of your traffic as it goes onto its real destination and try to get banking details and all that sort of stuff from it. Here's an example of one of those. This is actually what I recorded in a shoot last year. It was a shoot for another subject that I knew I had very little to do that week. And so I brought in my Wi-Fi Pineapple, plugged it into my laptop, set it up, and wiped everything from its history. And then as students walked in, I just turned it on. And these are the MAC addresses of the phones of the students in that class. As they walk in, they've just arrived. It was like a 9 o'clock class. They get out their phones to check on it. It turns on. The phone then goes, oh, sweet, what Wi-Fi points are around? I want to get some Wi-Fi. Most of them joined EduRoam, as you can see those two there. But the other things we can see listed here are other access points at their phones sort of queried and went, hey, are you here? Are you here? That's what our phones do. They go, hey, I was on this network yesterday. Is that available? And it says, hey, is the Skybus free Wi-Fi available? Is this available? Is that available? And so what you're able to do then with things like Wi-Fi Pineapples is actually go, oh, people are asking for Sky-Fi free Wi-Fi. Okay, Skybus free Wi-Fi. You then advertise that. Say, yep, this is here. And their phone then goes to it, sends you a credential. You don't even bother looking at it. You just go, yep, I accept that credential. And they connect to you. You provide them with internet. Meanwhile, you're looking at all their traffic as it goes through. Those sorts of things, a classic man-in-the-middle attack. It's very common these days. Things like airport lounges, Qantas clubs, Emirates Lounge, all those. It's a great place to set up with one of those and just grab a whole bunch of businessmen's credit card numbers. Not that I said that. Quite easy, classic man in the middle, and it just takes a very little bit of tech, very little knowledge. It's a very low level of skill for a fairly high likelihood of success. From a threat perspective, it's a bit of a nightmare. Those sorts of things often then run SSL strip. SSL strip then actually allows you to insert yourself in the middle of SSL communications. So they request a website, you say, yeah, I've got that available, here you go, and you provide it to them in HTTP or even your own certificate for HTTPS, and then your attacking device then connects the real website with correct certificates for that website and then provides the output that you've then modified down to the actual client that you're then attacking. All very easy to actually use. SSL strips are an open source thing, works with a whole bunch of different devices. And you're able to insert yourself in, even to man in the middle, depending on the devices. It's often a bit hard to defend against. SSL injection is actually stuff that the university is possibly, or about to be doing if they haven't done already, with a lot of our stuff that goes through the uni firewall. And so it's fairly easy to actually look at, and I might actually have an example later in lectures. It's not hard to actually detect. When this is happening to you, or a proxy firewall that's providing you with fake certificates to be able to read everything you're doing, they provide you with a certificate, and it looks like it's SSL. And it will actually appear as being SSL. But you can actually go in and look to see what is the key. What is the public key being used for this? If you're at home, when you know you're not having this happen to you, you can look up the public key for Facebook. And then if you're then in a place that's actually going to be doing SSL injection, you can then compare that certificate. Is this certificate I've got, is the public key that I'm currently seeing as being Facebook's one, matching what I know it is at home? If they don't match, it means you know you've been SUL man in the middle, which in a context like the university, where they're probably doing it now. I haven't checked for 6 months. I knew it was coming. They're doing it trying to actually make sure people aren't doing things on the uni they shouldn't be doing. It's quite common in corporate environments. Lots of government departments do it and that sort of stuff. It's very easy to check. You just look up, is this the right public key? Is it the public key I should be seeing? If it's not, you know that your content's not actually secure, certainly not from the organisation you're accessing it through. If anyone wants to talk about that later, we can. So denial of service, as I said, this is very common. We see it quite often sort of leaking a bit to the pop press, especially when really big ones occur. There's sort of two ways of doing this. You're either trying to take up all the resources on the actual device itself, so it literally doesn't have the ability to open any more ports, might run out of memory, might actually run out of CPU, depending on what the actual bottlenecks on the actual device are. You're using up that. And once that reaches its maximum, it can't open any new connections. That's sort of the classical way of doing it, especially with some of the particular ways you might do it, by opening up TCP connections and not finishing the handshake. So you do half the handshake and they're stuck there, sitting there, waiting for you to complete the handshake, and then it slowly times out. That's the way they used to work quite well. The other option is to actually just use up all of the network bandwidth. So you actually might not even be affecting the server itself, but you might use up all the bandwidth to the routers just slightly upstream from it. And targeting that as a way of being, well, that's actually the bottleneck. It's not necessarily the device. It might actually have enough RAM or whatever to deal with it. If we actually target particular parts of the upstream network, we might be able to knock that out easier. The idea, though, with these is to stop people from accessing the service. You're trying to stop legitimate users from using the service they want to use. As I said last week, there was one against GitHub for anyone who wants a topic for assignment or the first written task. They're often pretty hard to trace. These days they often get launched from botnets, and so the traffic is coming from compromised machines that are spread globally. Often they might be coming out of countries more like Russia and stuff that have, for whatever reason, large botnets there. Some of it's because of older machines that haven't been patched and stuff, easy to hack. Other of it's partly because of who you might be buying the botnet from through whatever service you're buying access to. It doesn't cost much for a botnet. I've looked up the prices before. I haven't done it this year again. I'll do it in a couple of weeks for some other lecture. I'll look up the price, see how much it costs for a botnet for an hour for a couple of 100,000 machines. It's usually not much, usually like a couple of $100 or something, which is kind of scary to think you get that much power for so little money. Code injection attacks. This is about thinking about, well, we've got a vulnerability in a more of a classical context. Maybe it's on a web server. And that vulnerability is if it receives certain inputs, it doesn't quite know how to deal with it. And so the classic sort of example of this might be like a buffer overflow and things. So we've got a programming flaw when the software was written, that when it receives certain inputs, it will then behave in a way that the attacker knows how it's going to behave, which is going to be to execute or to run some code on that device. If that code is to actually give them more access to that machine or create an account or whatever it might be, or maybe just delete the database, the attack goal might then be met. We'll have a little bit of a look at these in some of our tutes. But the primary goal, when you boil them all down, is to actually get the execution of the code to change. Instead of doing what it was designed to do, it's now going to do something slightly different. And that slightly different thing is what the attacker is then controlling. It might be executing a couple of lines of code that deletes the database, or it might be creating another user, or it could actually be inserting an entire another program into memory. There's a whole range of different things there. These come from mistakes during coding that then weren't caught. So buffer overflow is the classic case of that. We'll see this in practicals. There'll be a description of buffer overflow attack, and we'll see one demonstrated in the labs. Web injection is a bit more common these days that we might care about there, in that we write web code commonly, whereas we might not write that much conventional app software. SQL injections are pretty trivial. A lot of websites are sort of hardened against them these days, but not all of them are. I think I have in some other units, I have demonstrations of it. I don't think I've got a demonstration of SQL injection in this one. For a while there, historically, they were quite easy to run lots of places. Most of the ones that databases we use for the web these days have a bunch of design changes in them now that makes it much harder to do, but by no means impossible. If someone's done some poor coding, you can still get away with some. But what we might actually have as a result of this, other than possibly creating a user or deleting the database, is what it might often do is reveal information. So we might be doing some kind of search, and if we put in some sort of specially crafted query into that, it might select more content than it would actually want normally to output to us. So we might actually breach confidentiality that way and select a whole bunch of items instead of a specific defined subset. Cross-site scripting or a bunch of attacks that are either often JavaScript, but sometimes it's other kinds of scripting. We're then looking to actually try and run code on the client side, but it's sort of being delivered from the server, often from another server. So it might be that the ad platform gets hacked, the website we're actually using is fine, the ad platform has a problem, we write malicious code into there, and it goes out to all the websites that then actually are using that ad platform. That's sort of a worst case scenario. Other scenarios that are a bit more obvious and easy, we get sent some sort of IM through some platform, there's some vulnerability there, they then click that link and that inserts the JavaScript code. There's all sorts of web attacks. The main one that we're going to see in the lab is going to be like a browser-delivered one. And so clicking on a malicious link in a web browser. It's also fairly easy to make malicious Word and PDFs. So the person opens a PDF or a Word document, you then get that to execute code on their machine. In all three scenarios, browser, Word and PDF, there's levels of ways to make yourself more secure. There are a lot of it's around education of the users, because they're usually fairly easy to stop if your user isn't an idiot. But if you've got a couple of idiots, you're sort of stuffed. Opening things attached to emails, and then it says, do you want to enable macros? And they say, yeah. Suddenly you've got their machine. And it was all because that person opening that attachment should have thought, oh, hang on, where's this come from? Why is it asking about macros? I've been told I shouldn't be running macros on Word documents before, and now you've actually got their computer. A classic example that's beyond that as well is USB sticks. A lot of pen tests that do some stuff in person in addition to web, online sort of attacks, is what they'll do is they'll go to the car park for the organisation and just drop some USB sticks in the car park. People arrive at work, oh, USB stick, I'll pick that up, I'll be a good Samaritan. I'll find out whose it is, and then I'll return it to them. So they pick up the USB stick, they go into their office, they plug it into the machine, and suddenly they've now got malicious code running on their device. So all of these are all based around some vulnerability, usually, in allowing the code to execute. A lot of things like this can be stopped through patching, but not always. There's often a window there that a vulnerability might be there that people don't have a patch for yet, or in a corporate context, they might slowly roll out patches because they don't want it to break other corporate systems. So they might constantly be 3 months behind. So that means the attackers have got a 3-month window to try and run these sorts of vulnerabilities. So just to wrap up, some basic hardening steps. So these are all very Captain Obvious. We're not talking too much about defence in this unit, other than when we talk about all our policies and start researching stuff there. Servers and devices, we can harden them by turning off unnecessary services, and that's vitally important on servers. And we'll see that in the lab when we go to a port scan and we can see what services are running. If we're running more services than that box actually needs, all we've done is increase our attack surface. If we're a web server, we should be just running the web server. We don't need to be running an email server on the same box that's got no accounts attached to it. All we've done is made ourselves vulnerable to the email server kind of attacks that we wouldn't actually be vulnerable to before. We were just a web server. We want to follow vendor guidelines for an application. Now, what I mean by that is most vendors that sell us software will say you should do X, Y, Z to be secure. If we just get it and run it as it is and don't follow their instructions on how to harden it and how to make it secure, we're going to just open ourselves up to those vulnerabilities. We want to change default passwords and not use simple guessable ones, and that'll come out even more to us very apparently in week 13 with our cracking password one. Disable unnecessary accounts, very Captain Obvious, but it's amazing how often you hear of attacks of large corporate systems that occurred through unnecessary accounts still being left on with default passwords, that sort of stuff. Eliminate backdoors. Now this comes back around to the idea that things like firewalls, for them to work, have to be universal. If we've got multiple entry points into our network and we only defend a couple of them, the attackers are going to come in the other entryways. It's not uncommon for networks to have multiple entry points, and we need to make sure we're securing all of them and getting rid of as many of them as we can and only have the minimal number of entry points into our network. And obviously patching is important. Development itself is actually where a lot of security focus is these days. Secure DevOps, I could run a course on that. That's actually a really interesting and expanding part of a lot of development companies. So historically, in companies, you had your development team and you might have your operations team that are actually running the code that you've got. So whatever company you might be, but you've got people writing the code for your software, whatever it is, and you've got your ops teams delivering it to the world. If it's a web thing, it's web servers and whatnot. Then sort of 10 years ago or so, there started to be DevOps people that would actually there'd be development guys that sat on the ops team and ops people that sat on the dev team, and they were called DevOps, and that became the sort of sexy role to have. And they'd been both that way. They were as closely linked as they could be to make everything more efficient and agile and all those sort of fun words. In the last sort of 3 or 4 years, it's then now become actually we want DevSecOps so that we then have people that are our security people that are actually those DevOps people to make sure that at every point along that development through to operation chain are actually doing what they're doing in the most secure way possible. Because security is something that you need to look at in a holistic way. You need to see the whole picture. If you just try to secure it at the end, you're going to be insecure. If you just try to secure it at the start, other people aren't going to do what they're supposed to do. So you need to make sure every step along the way is being as secure as possible so that you then have the smallest attack surface possible. A lot of this, in terms of development, has all sorts of tools that help us from a security perspective these days. I know you can't see that, but the idea of this was to give you an idea of all the different vendors, and this is just some of them, that actually work in different parts of the industry, delivering different tools. Now, these are actually all ones that operate in the Australian industry, so it'd be more, if you went to Europe, you get a whole bunch of different names, China a whole bunch of different names, and America a whole bunch of different names. A lot of these are actually across all those areas. I've got, Microsoft up point here in this one. But if we look at these large categories, we can see we've got endpoint security, so it's our sort of virus detection kind of stuff. We've got IoT security, which is a growing one over here. We've got transaction security. We've got access and identity management. There's all these different categories, all with buckets of vendors providing tools to actually try and make sure everything we're doing is secure. It needs to be pervasive for organisations to actually end up being as secure as they can be. All right, so this half of the lecture did a quick overview of common attack types to make us sort of attack type literate, as it were. So as we go into our pen testing stuff in our practicals, we've got a bit of idea of what's going on. And then as we hit threat analysis and risk analysis later in semester, we've got some sort of level of open eyes of what we're looking at. All right, we'll finish up there. Just a reminder, next week's lecture in this time slot is not going to happen because it's a public holiday. It'll be on Thursday at 1 o'clock in the Stanley Burberry at the top of the hill.